I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
Hello, and welcome to Fast Thinking. My name is Irfan Nooruddin, and I am the director of the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. On April 14th, President Biden announced that the United States would be withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. Since then, the Taliban has rapidly regained territory across large swaths of the country, with several provincial capitals falling in recent days. Without air support and with supply lines and resources spread thin, it is tough to imagine a scenario in which the Afghan security forces can recapture the country. So, on this episode of Fast Thinking, we're asking, as troops withdraw, what can the United States do to support the Afghan security forces? And with the US out of the picture, how will regional powers influence the future of Afghanistan? Joining me today to unpack those questions is my colleague William Wechsler, Director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. Hi, Will.
Hey, how are you doing?
Well, so much to unpack and so little time. But let's start with the really big question. Obviously, with just a month to go to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the recent events couldn't possibly be worse news for the Biden administration. And yet it appears that the US government seems pretty resolute in defending its decision to honor the unconditional withdrawal of American troops by the end of the summer. So what happens now? What do you think the government is looking at? What are they hoping to achieve? How will they try and get there?
Well, I think you got it exactly correct. I think that the Biden administration has set its policy. The policy comes from President Biden himself and is unlikely to be altered in any meaningful way, at least through the anniversary of 9/11 and the subsequent near term that we can project. The challenge that I see is, while it is, in my mind, justifiable that the United States would want to remove from Afghanistan the capabilities of doing direct action, I worry that the administration has a gap in its policy, and that gap is the defense of Kabul. There's been a lot of opportunities for the president, for other members of the administration, to say that part of U.S. policy is to defend Kabul, and they've intentionally chosen not to say that. And that's a real problem, because while the Afghan military is likely incapable of independently defending, certainly the entire countryside and likely several major population centers, Taliban, it is potentially capable of defending Kabul. The likelihood of it doing so increases if the United States was still going to have some advisors to provide assistance to for those Afghan forces for the foreign internal defense mission, and it would also increase if the psychological dynamic that we're seeing today wasn't so prevalent. Right now, I'm afraid to say a lot of people in Afghanistan are trying to hedge their bets because they're looking at the potential of a clear Taliban success, and ironically and sadly, that furthers the momentum towards that very collapse. That psychological development is really as old as warfare itself, and that's what we're seeing again. Do you see the same thing in Afghanistan?
I do. I mean, that psychological element is really a very insightful point. I think the rapidity of the Taliban advances, the clear sense that the United States has made a decision and isn't going to go back on it, really does leave the Afghan forces on their own in a way that they haven't been ever. And I think a lot of folks, including the regional actors that we'll talk about in a little bit, are really looking at that and saying this is a very different landscape than maybe we anticipated. But before we talk about that, Will, obviously you spent so much of your career thinking about counterterrorism issues as well. And at the end of the day, the US entered this longest of wars as a direct response to the horrific attacks of 9/11, 2001. And now we are sitting in a situation where there might be an all-out civil war disorder again. Even if the Taliban doesn't take Kabul, it potentially raises a situation in which conditions are really ripe for terrorist activities to once again flourish as a home base in Afghanistan, at least Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Is that a concern, and what can the United States do to protect itself against renewed attacks?
It's a huge concern, and it's sad to say about Afghanistan as someone who, like myself, has spent a lot of time over the last 20 years thinking and working on Afghanistan. The reality is the terrorist threat from al-Qaeda, from the Islamic State, from other Salafi jihadist organizations that are there and might emerge in the future. That's where the core vital U.S. national security interest was at the beginning. That's where it remains. And sadly, those terrorist organizations have not disappeared. So what the Biden administration is telling us is that we're going to move to an over-the-horizon counterterrorism campaign. That, as anybody who has done counterterrorism professionally, is very hard, even in the best of circumstances, for all sorts of practical reasons about the decline of actionable intelligence, the lengthy time to target for our air assets. But it will be especially ineffective if the Taliban eventually does take Kabul and the U.S. is forced to withdraw its embassy entirely. That was the context in which I first worked on counterterrorism in Afghanistan in the mid-90s. And our efforts then were insufficient to prevent 9/11. What's going to happen is that whether or not they take Kabul, as you say, given the Taliban problems and given the interconnections between the Taliban and al-Qaeda, although the Taliban and the Islamic State's relations are a completely different matter, but given the wide interrelations, that we have every reason to expect that al-Qaeda will once again in Afghanistan establish a sanctuary, and from which, once it has that sanctuary, it will believe that it can operate with what it sees as an acceptable degree of impunity. So if I might, just looking ahead, there's really only three scenarios that we can see. The first is that al-Qaeda or the other terrorist organizations will no longer seek to conduct external attacks once they have that sanctuary. I find that to be a very hard argument to make, and I really think the burden of proof is on anyone who would make that argument, because so far we see a remarkably impressively consistent track record from these organizations of moving to external attacks in those circumstances. The second scenario is that the terrorist organizations will try to conduct a terrorist act, but that the Taliban will prevent them from doing so, or at least prevent them from doing so against American targets. I've heard that argument a lot. That to me is a very risky argument and assumes that what we believe to be in the Taliban's interests is, in the end of the day, what they think is in their interests. And we've seen, of course, a lot of gaps over the decades from that. And the third scenario is that eventually the Afghanistan-based terrorist organizations will conduct external attacks, unimpeded by the Taliban. Then what we're left with is the machine that we've created after 9/11 to try to prevent that from happening. And I think, unfortunately, it's on that basis, the success or failure of that counterterrorism machine will lie the ultimate success or failure of the Biden administration's policy towards Afghanistan. That's how this administration will be judged.
I think that's right, Will. And, just to pivot to the regional players, I think that's a large part of the calculus that we are seeing happening in Islamabad, in Tehran, in Moscow and in Beijing, which is that even if, the new normal in Afghanistan, once fighting dies down and, maybe there's a Taliban government once again in Kabul, or maybe there's some sort of power sharing agreement, maybe in fact the Afghan forces somehow come out on top, that a lot of the immediate border states worry that a war-torn return to the 1990s means bad things for them. At the end of the day, as devastating as the attacks of 9/11 were, the folks in Pakistan would tell us that they've borne the brunt of refugee flows. The large Muslim populations in Western China, in the Russian periphery, and of course the Shia-Sunni split that gives Iran a sort of stake in some of these dynamics, means that all of those actors are also very involved. And what's interesting about that is that I think none of them, at least based on my conversations, seem to have any love lost for the Taliban. They just really want stability. And what they're worried about right now is if they bet on the wrong horse, meaning if they just come in all in on the government and the Taliban manages to win, that's bad news for them. And so I think we've got this really awful dynamic in which no one wants outcome, but everyone seems to have accepted its inevitability. And that potentially makes it, in fact, the real thing that's going to happen. There's so much we could be talking about. We run out of time, but thanks so much for joining me to talk about these big questions. And needless to say, one really wished that we weren't having to have this particular version of the conversation. Exactly. But regardless, I know you'll be there to continue to provide great analysis, as will our colleagues throughout the Atlantic Council. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. I always love conversations with you.